If Dr. Richard C. Miller's correct, then most people have no clue whatsoever on the origins of Christianity, what's going on in Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, the resurrection of Jesus, the empty tomb, all of the above. There are some scholars, like Richard Carrier, like Robin Faith Walsh, like Dennis R. MacDonald, and others, Bart Ehrman, who recognize this as legend. Richard C. Miller's work is the one behind these scholars who've really made a huge impact on recognizing the empty tomb narrative is a translation fable. His book, Resurrection and Reception, is what we discussed today. And he explains what caused him to write this book. He has 3 master's degrees and a PhD from Claremont. He went through Yale, he went through Princeton, he went through Harvard, he went through several higher upper educational institutions. And at the end of the day, none of them ultimately taught him what he had learned at the end of the road. I hope that you enjoy this interview. Dr. Richard C. Miller will be making more appearances, and thank you to everybody who is in the Patreon because you made this trip possible. Several other of the recordings will be released early for you. Again, I thank you. Dr. Richard C. Miller, your book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, how do I put this? Before I read this book, I had certain ideas. And like everything that's a paradigm changer, I came across this book thanks to Derek Bennett saying, you really should check out this guy. He quoted you in some of his presentations he did on my channel. And I was like, okay. And I got a hold of you. And I was like, all right, Rick, so let's try and tell me, what do you know about Christianity? What is it? What is it? Why did you write this book? And I started reading it, and I'm not going to lie, I was quite impressed because I also want to, as your testimony, see where this thing came from. Where did Christianity have its birthplace? You know, you want to know about a child, you really need to know about their parents. And people imagined that Christianity was just born almost like a virgin birth by the mother Judaism, as if Judaism was it. There's no daddy involved. It's almost like they have this religion where they believe in a virgin birth. It's weird. So why did you write this book? And this book, I love this book. It's one of the best books I've ever read on New Testament studies. So please take us into this.
It was up in the air, even during my research there at the Claremont colleges. It was up in the air what I was going to do my dissertation on. Even though I had done that early work with Romulus, I was worried because this is such a serious topic. This is a topic of such significant consequence for so many people in this religion, the way it's constructed in the modern world. And so I knew this was consequential. I knew that my parents wouldn't like it if this was my research. I knew that I probably wouldn't be asked back to any churches. I knew that I probably wouldn't even be asked to be a professor anywhere over this topic. I knew that it was too upsetting for too many people. But I didn't get into the game for those reasons. I got into the game because I wanted to answer some very serious questions. I want to know the truth. And I want to be able to put that together in a way that would be consumable for other people. And so I met with James Robinson, who is one of the founding fathers of the Claremont colleges. You know, he's now passed on, unfortunately, but he was a very inspiring man and a presence there at the colleges. I took him out to dinner one night as a doctoral student there here in the community and asked him, what's the secret to greatness? And he said, well, the secret to greatness is contribution. Whoever contributes the most is the greatest. Do something significant. Don't write on stuff that doesn't matter. He said, have you done any research on anything that really matters to anyone? And I started to describe to him some of my work with this. And he said, that matters. And I started to kind of chew on that and think about it, and that, you know, obviously the dinner went on and we enjoyed that and everything, but that was something I took away from that conversation. And probably the reason I took him out actually was to ask him that question, because he had had such a huge impact in the 20th century in New Testament studies. thought about it for a long time, and I thought, if I write this book, it's going to land outside of so many people's paradigm, and even in our field, it's very taboo to even address this topic. Certainly then, and I think less so now. People are becoming more and more open to this kind of research. But I thought, this is me. This is who I am in this world. This is the stuff this is what I like to do. I want to write a book that I would want to read.
So getting into your previous video we did on your testimony, if you haven't watched that, I highly recommend you go and watch it so you understand a little bit more about Dr. Miller. But you, just like me, when I was young, and I prayed, I would walk down the street in my neighborhood, my mom's neighborhood I grew up in, mom and dad's, and I would ask God, after reading the story about Solomon, and Solomon literally sacrifices 1,000 cattle on the high place. And at that time, high places were cool, at least according to the story. Later on, they'd destroy them. But God comes to him in a dream and says, ask, son, whatever you ask, and I'll give it to you. I want wisdom. He asks for wisdom. You didn't ask for your enemies' deaths. You didn't ask for money. You wanted wisdom. Well, I'll give you wisdom and all of the other things too. I wanted to be like Solomon. I wanted to be the wisest. I wanted to know the truth. I wanted the answers. And that's what I gained from you, is that you want to know what the truth is. And I did not know when I was asking God that question that the truth was not the being I was asking the question the way I had perceived it. And so you finding out truth led you actually down a path that the very voice you were talking to, the thing you were discussing to, would have been the thing that you actually were finding out was just you all along, I guess. But
yeah,
what about this book? What was so true about this book that you found? What was so true about your work that you weren't seeing out there that you needed to publish this?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. There's almost kind of like a bell curve as you go through your academic career. And some people never make it all the way through it to actual definitive conclusions. Some people, the more they learn, the more confused their picture gets for some reason. I went through that to some extent. There's a period where you're learning, but you just don't know enough yet to really connect all the dots. I had gotten to a point where I was connecting the dots, and it coalesced with this. It's kind of a nexus. And I came to the point where I know this is true. This is unavoidable. There's too much evidence here. It mounted too heavily as I pulled that thread further and further in terms of my investigation into the translation fable and that tradition in Antiquity, and how much that is integral to the New Testament constructions of Jesus and textualizations of Jesus, and just the way that he was handled in terms of that early cult. I came to the point where I was 100% confident. I know that upsets Richard Carrier. He wants it to be 99.99, and so I get that. But I walked away from it. And the thing with this kind of a book that's strange is that because of Pascal's wager, for me to take this position on this book, I had to bet not just my career or my reputation, but my eternal destiny. I had to put that on the table too. I had to put on the table, if I'm wrong about this book is basically a first-class ticket to hell. And in the minds of many Christians, I just took down the most sacred narrative in Western civilization, the most sacred narrative in the history of human existence. In their eyes, now I don't see it that way. I don't see me taking down anything. I see myself understanding with precision what was intended in the earliest Christian texts. But in the eyes of many people, if I'm wrong on this, it's not going to end well for me, right? And so I had to be very confident. And I achieved that confidence through my study, and I got to the point where I know I was losing no sleep whatsoever over that question. And I thought, there's something unfair about this. I went through 3 master's degrees, a PhD program. No one taught me this stuff. I learned it outside of this discipline in a classics department.
So getting into some of the content in here, because our unfolding videos that we will have are going to elaborate on details, birth narratives, post-mortem appearance, like getting into the intricacies. But I'd like to ask you why you started with Justin. You have an interesting way in which you open this book and you're like, we need to deal with this guy named Justin Martyr. Why that? You could have chose other paths. You could have gone to Origin. You could have gone to this guy. You could have gone here. What made you go, I want you to see your hero? Like, why Justin? Yeah. And then work backwards. Well, what the heck is that about?
Well, it may surprise you. Actually, it wasn't my original. I discovered that text pretty far along in my research, actually, that passage in Justin that I quote at the beginning. I was already confident in but then I went over and started to read, okay, well, I better cross my T's, dot my I's. I better go and make sure that I've done due diligence on each of the church fathers, learn whatever I can there. Now, my rigor is from a scientific method. If I find something that upsets my particular paradigm or model of understanding, I let that inform it and reshape it. Mm-hmm. I don't just resist it. I want to know something that's going to upset my perspective in some way, because I'm going to learn something from that. That to me is treasure. And so I was combing through all of the early church writings, especially the apologists. These were the defenders. These are the ones getting most rigorous about propping up the Christian faith in the face of skepticism. And so I wanted to read them. Justin was pretty much the earliest major guy. He's pretty much the grandfather of that tradition. And so I actually was afraid in some ways as I read through it. I was afraid that I might find something that would completely shatter my view. I mean, the counterpoint to what I just said. But as I came across this passage, I mean, there's only a few places where he talks about resurrection, and maybe one or two actually. And this is where he gets to it, touches right to the heart of it. And I was I felt like, okay, if I go with the New Testament and use that as the foundation for my study, even though that's where my research began originally, then it might not be as powerful than if I say, okay, even the early Christians were saying and admitting and dealing with this. That to me was, I'm done, tap out, it's over. If they're admitting it, talking about it, the argument just ended. There's nothing left.
See, I feel like while I read this book, you really put a microscope on Justin. You hear him confess, I murdered that person. Here's the knife. It's under the bed in that room. And here's how I did it. And then you're like, okay, the rest of your book, in using that analogy, and I want to give people who may be ignorant of it, what did Justin say? Well, he literally compares the resurrection of Jesus, really the whole Jesus mythos, we have this perception, which you're going to elaborate. Not only do you do it in your book, but in your articles and reviews and your critique of Litwa's work, of various things. Anyone can go and check that out, but also throughout these interviews that we're hoping to get out, that he compares Jesus and the mythos of Jesus with the rest of the sons of Zeus and Caesars and the whole nine, with eyewitness testimony, the whole nine. And you're like, this isn't just a comparison to Zeus. This isn't just a comparison to Hercules, Asclepius, Bacchus, various, figures. It even mentions Caesars and eyewitnesses to Caesars. It goes beyond what you thought, maybe this is a gold mine. So once you did that, I felt like the rest of your book, you go, all right, we got to explain why Justin's murder scene is here. And let me show you why there's a long tradition of murder scenes. And it's
Thank you.
It was detective work.
Yeah, and what I also was surprised to find, now I found that, but I found more. In fact, I didn't find anything that disagreed with that. And that's the thing that was the most profound for me, is as I looked through the earliest Christian discussions where they got most honest and clear on these topics, where they spoke to it most clearly, the more I was convinced that they were not producing a historiological argument around this case that we think was the linchpin and why everyone is being martyred and all this. That was just not on the table for them. They weren't talking about it that way. And so if anything, when I got to those passages, they were, using it as a springboard to talk about resurrection generally as an idea. Okay. You even find that in Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. He uses that, you get a few verses there, and then he jumps off into, okay, now let's get to the real topic, resurrection of the dead. This is what I want to get to. And so he's trying to sell that as an idea. And so there's a larger kind of discussion around that, because that was in the marketplace of ideas. That was an important topic. But what was conspicuously absent from end to end was, as I surveyed countless texts for the first, like, say, 4 centuries of Christendom, or the Christian tradition, rather, where was this historical case being propped up? You'd think you'd find it repeatedly over and over again. Where's the discussion of the 500 who saw him? Why isn't that being talked about constantly? If that was the linchpin of everyone's kind of ideology and commitment to this religion, then why is it absent everywhere? Even, and it's worse than that, the texts that survive are the ones that were in best service to orthodoxy. We don't have all the texts. These are the ones that were the best. These are the ones that were the most helpful towards that. And so, at that point, if we're going to be true to how the religion began, it wasn't on that foundation that people presume today.
That's what I find in this book, and that's what made me have that hiccup of 1 Corinthians 15. Was like, hold on, I've been reading this. Like, this is what he's like literally saying. So I have to rationalize what Paul's experience was. And there are many friends of mine online, I hope, watch this, and I hope that you take some notes, because you're going to hear something different here. Instead of having to come up with various hypotheses of hallucination theory, of cognitive dissonance perspectives, and don't get me wrong, cognitive dissonance could still work in certain things about apocalypticism or whatever, but like trying to explain resurrection in some way in this respect. And we are asking a different question and dealing with a different kind of opponent when it comes to that thing. Really what we were. We're dealing with ourselves, because what we were. We thought literal historical, Jesus died, he rose. This is testimony here. Paul's mentioning this. He's got eyewitnesses. He's got gospels talking about they saw him. All of that. The way we were reading this, we didn't even know we weren't even reading this thing right, is what I'm finding out your book is trying to suggest. And you're going to delve deeper into that. You get into Martyr. You mention like every little thing you've wrote articles are on in this book about the martyrology stuff, dealing with each gospel. You get into the translation fables. In chapter 2, you list so many different people when the body went missing, that either from drowning in a river, in a battle they go missing, lightning bolt struck them, in a tomb. Literally, there are tomb ones. And that may not be the most common, but whoop-de-doo, you don't need that to be, you only need a few to recognize, like, okay, that's also a trope. If someone's put in a tomb and they go missing, people go, oh, he's a god, or she's a god. It's like, well, what's that mean when Jesus goes missing? The author's maybe winking at you because you already know. So that's chapter 2.
Yeah. So when I went into my research, as you'll see there in the foreword, I picked 3 classicists and 1 New Testament. I felt like I already knew what the New Testament people what they had said. I'd hung out with them for several graduate programs, and so I had enough of from that input in terms of this. I pivoted to classicists because I felt like they were coming from the most honest framework on these topics. And so a lot of my research is just, in fact, all of chapter 2, you could completely pull out chapter 2 and use it for any number of purposes in classics. It has nothing to do with Christianity in that way. It's a tour, kind of what I call the gallery, and it's basically a list of translated figures. I think there's upward to 100 of them if you go, beginning to end throughout my book. And what were the patterns in those stories? And how were those stories conveyed? And how did they register in the ancient mind? What were they doing with those stories? What was the point of them? And so that's what I get into there. And yeah.
I love it. That really made me go, Again, I thought this was unique and there was nothing else out there like it. And don't get me wrong, it's its own unique story, but it's like, it's in a long line of things like that. Chapter 3, the critical method in the Gospels. When I read it, because this is a dense book, very difficult to get through for someone like me. I had to Google a lot of definitions. But while I was reading this, chapter 3 felt to me, when I look back on, rooting You had to root the New Testament. It's almost that question of like, does the New Testament Greek Gospels and literature fit in classicist material? Should we put it as, this is also Greek literature, treat it like we do other classics? And you were trying to put it back in its place, whereas you have issues. Classicists are told to stay away. You talk about that in chapter 1, where you're already dealing with certain classicists go, ooh, there's that line, I'm not going to cross it. And you say, I'm crossing it. Follow me. I'm going.
Yeah.
And putting it back in its Greek context of the classic world, the Greek, Roman, classical world.
Yeah.
That's, I think, where you get in the most trouble. Can you tell us a little bit about that? But your case is strong of rooting it into the language. Like if I said, hey, that's groovy, man.
Yeah.
You'd be like 70s, hippie, something's like in America. He's like, this would root you into a certain cultural context where I'm saying groovy, man, or Australia. Maybe people are using that language there.
Right.
But it would automatically signal. And you really want to give people into the Zipsenleben. You want them in the fabric of the time, the zeitgeist, the milieu to know what this literature is saying. And there's so many signals in the New Testament of placing it there.
Well, yes. I mean, so the best scholarship today pretty much has the Gospels written in the major urban centers, one or the other, in the Greek East, in the Levant. And so this is the Hellenistic world. Hellenism was huge in these cities. And this is where converts would have first encountered, most of them would have encountered this text. Now, it's interesting that, I'd studied early Judaism, but if you look at the Mishnah, it's kind of hard to, people try to mine things out of there. And there are insights that can be had there. But I think we need to face the facts that Judaism was largely untouched by the rise of Christianity. More or less. I mean, we could make a counter argument to that, but in comparison to its impact on the Roman and the Greek world, it caught on like wildfire. And within, say, 3 or 4 centuries, had created a full-scale cultural revolution in that world. So that's where these texts are getting traction, not in Jerusalem, largely rejected in Judea. So for us to make that the interpretive framework for these texts is ridiculous. These were texts that were marketed. I don't know if, maybe any of the viewers have ever taken a marketing course, but that's where these texts that's where they were trafficked, that's where they were read, that's where they were written, that's where they found their meaning, that's where the tradition took off. And so in its earliest, humblest beginnings, that's where we find it.
That's very powerful. You say in your book something to the effect of like, is this Hellenistic Judaism, or is this a Judaizing of some Hellenistic movement? It's very difficult to say. And to tease people, just to give one example, it is written, and then it quotes. And I get a lot of criticism for people against McDonald's work and others who go, well, we know they're mimetically drawing from the scriptures because it says it is written. And the next thing you know, Jesus looks like Moses or Elijah or whoever. And it's like, all right, you needed training wheels to see this. Okay, good for you. The fact that they told you helped you draw that conclusion. Then they have a problem because they go, well, where does it quote? And it's so funny because if you would go back into the mind of what you've studied into the original Greek Roman audiences that were hearing this stuff, they would probably look at that modern person who goes, quote? Are you an idiot? Right. You can't see it? This is literally bleeding with our history, our mythos, our legend. What are you talking about? If you need to be quoted, you're in kindergarten at this point. You don't even see what's going on.
Right. I mean, you could make the count, even pivot even further and say, these were readers that were so unsteeped or ignorant of the classical Hebrew writings that they needed that special direction. They required it. Mark talks about people, and he has this little blurb in there that he inserts about, oh, and by the way, when the Jews eat, they need to wash their pots and pans because this is part of their their purification customs and this sort of thing. And you don't have to tell that to Jewish people. That's like telling football teams what a football is. Right. That's ridiculous. So these texts, you could say that there might have been some Hellenistic Jewish consumption, and I'm fine with that, yeah. But also it has a valence that extends far out from that And these were texts that were clearly had in their sights the broader Hellenistic and Roman world. Even if they are set in Palestine in terms of their literary context, even if they are presenting an alternative kind of mythos, they are wholly reliant upon the existing kind of bedrock of myth in that world. And so they wouldn't have gotten anywhere had they not been.
And the last chapter, just to get into, because we're going to get into this. Trust me, stay tuned. And if you're a Patreon member, thank you for supporting, because this stuff's early for you. You are what makes this possible. And that is the translation, Fables, and the Gospels. I haven't even exhausted your work, your research, what you've done, re-examined this material, but can you tell us what chapter 4 is about? Because it's like I've just to tease, maybe correct me if I'm wrong. I'm having fun having a dialogue.
Yeah.
You're circling back to the murder weapon. You're going, remember Justin at the beginning of this thing? All right. Do you see what I'm talking about? Do you see why Justin said what he said? Here it is. Right. I gave you everything. Now we're at the final conclusion, chapter 4, translation fable, in the evidence of the New Testament. What do you discover?
Well, yeah, I mean, just one statement about Justin. I think a lot of people, I've even seen people online that dismiss my work out of it. They haven't read it at all. They read that first little bit, or even watch your Easter video, which was awesome. And they just dismiss it out of hand as, oh, that's not what he meant, or whatever. Or he's trying to appeal to the Roman or the Hellenistic mind or whatever. No. We need to take him very seriously. He's being very honest. We need to take all of these early writers very seriously. They're not kidding when they write things. They mean it. And it's interesting that when you read through something like Justin, you find all sorts of names and places and concerns and arguments that are utterly alien to most modern Christian thought. And it's easy to go roughshod over that and not take it seriously. I'm trying to take him seriously and go back. And so in chapter 4, as we get to the Gospels, we've done kind of the groundwork. I've given the gallery of translation figures. It's not exhaustive. It's just a sampling, cross-section. And then I've gotten into some methodology there. And now it's time to actually finish the job and get to the New Testament Gospels and see to what extent were these mimetic signals, these tropological signals that were part of the language of translation. It's not just a parallel. This is how you this is how you signal in another person's mind, hey, register this story in this way. You know how when you change the channel on the TV, you know instantly if you're watching a Western, right? Right. You see the tumbleweed there. You see, the good guy coming to town. Maybe he's gonna, rescue the maiden or whatever. The tumbleweed guy. Yeah, he's gonna get the villain in the end. And he's gonna save the town. You've got that kind of generic, kind of frame set up instantly. In only less than a second, if you were to change the channel, you would all of that would be invoked in your mind. That's what's going on with the translation fable. There are certain signals, and I call them out there. I think there's a dozen or so. Each one basically helping us to pick up on when, and helping, more importantly, the ancient reader to pick up on when translation is implied and what that means. And so what were they trying to say? So this is structural language. It's not the language that you would get in a lexicon where you're just looking at a single word. You're looking at a story pattern that was meant to, and there were certain signals in there to set off in the reader's mind or the listener's mind, hey, this is that kind of story. Orient yourself toward that. Get ready to process it in this fashion. Read it in this fashion. And so there are different directing signals there. And that's really what I try to get into in the 4th chapter, is how those are deployed in the New Testament.
And what I found, what shocked me more than anything, and for those who get the book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, page 175, he starts his mimetic signal list with various reference sources. So there's like original sources you can go check out: missing body, prodigies, darkness over the land, mountaintop speech, great commission, ascension, son of God, meeting on the road, eyewitness testimony, taken away in a cloud, dubious alternative accounts, immortal heavenly body, outside the city, the people flee, deification, belief, homage, and rejoicing, bright and shining appearance, frightened, all in sorrow over loss, inspired message of apotheosis. And of course, this isn't in like one gospel that covers all of them. Like, you take the collection of what we see as the canonical text, and let alone you find these legends. What blew me away is I went, but I also see some of this in Paul. That's when, for me, it was like I had already kind of thought of the Gospels mythic in some sense. When we got into Paul, that's when I went, what's Paul doing? And that changed the game for me. So I hope people will get the book. Seriously appreciate you. This is your bread and butter. This is your special baby right here of what you've produced. And so I hope people will appreciate that.
It's my primary contribution to human civilization. If I'm going to have one, this is it. I hope to write more, but this is something that I feel like I'm proud of. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Yeah, thank you.
I hope you liked my dad, Richard Miller, in this interview. Remember to like and subscribe. And never forget, we are MythVision.